Hi class, welcome to the Lesson 12 lecture on the Turbulent 1960s. The reason I call it the Turbulent 1960s is that the 1960s witnessed the rise of so many new social movements, really just to an unprecedented extent. It was a time of change. You had the civil rights movement and the more militant offshoots of the civil rights movement, such as the black nationalist movement led by people like Malcolm X. And then you had what I call the black radical movement, those who weren't strictly nationalist, who uh, felt like there was like economic oppression of blacks was just as big of a problem, if not more, than racist oppression. So you had people like the Black Panthers who kind of emphasized this approach to the oppression of African Americans. And, the reason I call them black radicals is they foresaw some sort of not just getting equal legal rights like the civil rights movement wanted, but getting some sort of like socialist transformation of society. So they were black radicals, kind of went off in that direction. So in our discussion forums this week, you'll kind of see snapshots or excerpts from all three of these movements. Martin Luther King representing the civil rights movement, and then Malcolm X representing the black nationalist movement, and then a black radical by the name of Julius Lester, who's not very well known, but he became an academic and published author. He kind of wrote from a black radical perspective. You're going to read a short article from him as well. So you have these movements that really set the stage, and especially the civil rights movement, which served as a model for all these other movements in terms of its tactics, its achievements, really inspired these other movements. Then you have the hippie movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, Students for a Democratic Society, which was a socialist student movement, an anti-war student movement, free speech movement on campuses, the women's liberation movement, otherwise known as second wave feminism, fighting for not just the right women's right to vote like first wave feminism, but more workplace equality, less constrictive gender norms, that sort of thing. The gay liberation movement, the American Indian movement, the environmentalist movement, on and on and on. There's probably some I'm forgetting to mention here. There was also a conservative reaction against some of these movements. So not all Americans were on board with these movements. In fact, you could make a strong argument based on electoral results from the 60s that the majority of Americans were actually still very conservative, still very suspicious, skeptical of some of these vast proposed changes to American society. The fact that uh, people like Richard Nixon, overwhelmingly won election and then re-election, 1972, kind of testifies to the possibility that there was still this sort of silent majority out there in American society. This is what Richard Nixon called this group. Um, and these would be the people who aren't really vocally out there in the streets protesting, but who are quietly kind of disapproving of some of these challenges to existing American norms. And you could make a strong argument that they actually made up still the majority of American society, by the late 60s, early 70s. Let's first look at the civil rights movement and how it served as a model for these other movements. The civil rights movement was the first of these major movements to gather momentum soon after World War II, as African American veterans reflected on how they still felt like second-class citizens despite their sacrifices in yet another war effort. And the eventual successes of the civil rights movement helped inspire all the other movements of the 1960s. So I want to go into a little more detail on the civil rights movement in particular here. A lot of it had to do with segregation and Jim Crow laws in the southern states. The civil rights movement of the 1960s was partly the result of the failed Reconstruction programs following the Civil War, 100 years prior, still unfinished, unaddressed problems. The newly freed ex-slaves of the 1860s and 1870s made, of course, significant gains during Reconstruction with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. However, when legal loopholes and vigilante terrorism restored the white supremacist Democrats to power in southern state governments and federal troops abandoned the freedmen to their fate, many gains were lost. Funds for black public education were cut, and when populism tried to unite black and white sharecroppers, the Democrats enacted laws to disenfranchise Southern African Americans and imposed racial segregation through Jim Crow laws, such as literacy tests for voting, grandfather clauses that exempted white voters from these literacy tests because their right to vote was grandfathered in, poll taxes, which were fees for voting, and racial segregation in public facilities and in private establishments that served the public, such as restaurants and so on. And then a lot of this was helped along by various Supreme Court verdicts. We often think of Supreme Court verdicts as being nonpartisan and objective, but when we look at how civil rights cases evolved, we can see that Supreme Court justices were products of their time period just as much as other people were. So they weren't, looking at things with what we would consider nowadays as supreme far-sighted wisdom. They were caught up in the prejudices of their own time. So, for example, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 ruled that railroad passengers could be segregated as long as equal accommodations were provided. This is the famous separate but equal verdict. Then there was another case, less well known, Cumming versus Richmond County Board of Education in 1899, where the court ruled that segregation of school children was permitted even if accommodations for black children did not exist or were of subpar quality. This went even beyond Plessy versus Ferguson in rationalizing unequal treatment of blacks. And then finally, if we fast forward to Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, here segregation of public schools was ruled to inherently lead to unequal outcomes and was held to be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So after this point, public schools were under the legal requirement to racially integrate, although many schools dragged their feet on this, and it really wasn't until 3 years afterwards that the first hesitant steps toward this were made in schools in the South, with the Little Rock High School being the leading example. So state governments were still hesitant to actually implement this decision. So this was these moves in the courts towards desegregation were aided by executive action by the presidents of the time. So Franklin Roosevelt banned racial segregation in war industry work during World War II. Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces entirely in 1948. And in 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower issued an executive order to force the Arkansas National Guard to allow black students into Little Rock High School, and he sent elements of the 101st Airborne Division to supervise this process. The reason he had to do that was because the Arkansas governor had called on the Arkansas National Guard to keep the black students out of the formerly all-white school, supposedly in order to protect the black students against white mobs and to keep the peace. Even though, in theory, the Arkansas National Guard could have done something about the white mobs and arrested them for threatening, the black students, but almost the way it was addressed at first by the Arkansas governor almost made it sound like it was the black students' fault for showing up and provoking the white mobs to get angry about the whole thing. So the solution was to just keep the black students out and then problem solved, right? Well, Dwight Eisenhower didn't think so. He thought, well, Supreme Court has spoken, we need to implement this decision, and so on. Eventually, the United States also got around to legislative action against segregation, which it frustrated a lot of the more militant civil rights activists and Black Power activists like Malcolm X that it took so long to get around to this legislation. You'll see in the discussion forum documents for this week just how frustrated it was that by early 1964 there still wasn't any significant legislation to desegregate, you know, facilities. But finally, in later 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act, which banned racial segregation in facilities that served the public and banned racial discrimination in hiring, which was enforced through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Then the next year, you had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which instituted federal supervision of local and state level elections in order to keep southern states from disenfranchising black voters through legal loopholes. And then later on, you had another Civil Rights Act of 1968, which banned racial discrimination in housing policies. So with all these achievements, what were the secrets to the civil rights movement's successes? What were the lessons that other reform movements sought to learn? How can we replicate these successes? Well, first of all, it had to do with growing cultural prestige of African Americans. You had people like Jesse Owens, the Olympic gold medalist, Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Ralph Bunche, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and other respectable-looking African Americans in the growing middle class that helped to legitimize the African American community in the eyes of white Americans. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, always made a point to wear a nice suit and encourage all of his followers to do likewise whenever they went on protest marches. Wanted to look their best, not look like a rowdy, disheveled mob. Plus, there were the repeated sacrifices of African Americans in the World War II war effort. So this cultural prestige helped, to show that we are people too, we are American citizens too. We're a positive force for society. We deserve to get something in return, equal treatment. Number two is the accumulation of allies to their cause, such as the Communist Party USA, the CIO, church groups, and other groups started speaking up more for African Americans. Even white churches who were affiliated with the black churches started to speak up. In fact, my grandfather, he was a Unitarian minister, and he participated in some civil rights events in the early 60s. Education and media attention. For example, civil rights activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee launched the Mississippi Freedom Summer project to get blacks registered to vote and to educate blacks and whites alike on the importance and justice of racial desegregation. Then you have boycotts, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott. Protest marches. Biggest example of that would be the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King made his famous I Have a Dream speech. But there were other protest marches too, like the march in Selma, Alabama, others. Nonviolent civil disobedience, which oftentimes, not always, but sometimes went along with the protest marches. And this also included sit-ins in racially segregated restaurants or freedom rides on racially segregated buses, which sometimes provoked fire bombings from white vigilantes in response. And then seventh tactic would be sort of the black power, the militant rhetoric and approach of people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, for example, not only setting up breakfast programs for their poor inner city communities, which helped a lot, but also arming their communities with guns to stand up for themselves. And this approach probably helped even people like Martin Luther King Jr., who didn't completely agree with this more radical approach. And I say it probably helped because it made Martin Luther King Jr. seem like the more reasonable alternative by comparison. The implied message was white America should compromise with Martin Luther King Jr. and his message of peaceful integration and equality, or else blacks would riot, as they did in hundreds of cities in the 1960s, and or they would sign on with more radical groups. So if you want to nip that in the bud, you got to make some compromises with the black community. Another part of the 60s was what Lyndon Johnson ended up calling the Great Society, or the War on Poverty. After all, many African Americans and other Americans in general felt that the attainment of mere legal equality was not meaningful enough by itself. What about real practical equality of economic opportunity? Some African Americans asked, for example, what about reparations? What happened to the 40 acres and a mule that we were going to get after the Civil War? How are we going to be compensated for the failure to start us off on a more level economic playing field? What about jobs? What about education? What about healthcare? Americans were becoming more aware of the persistent and severe poverty overlooked in the 1950s. The thousands of blacks who had migrated north to find themselves unemployed and ignored in the slum ghettos of the cities had demonstrated their despair and desperation with race riots in the long, hot summers of the 1960s. President Johnson responded by appointing the Khmer Commission, which found that black Americans were disproportionately impoverished. 40% of African Americans lived below the federal government's poverty line. Black men were twice as likely to be unemployed as white men and 3 times as likely to hold unskilled jobs. The commission concluded that poverty was the cause of the wave of crime and civil unrest. Quote, "Chronic poverty is a breeder of chronic chaos." But there were many whites who also lived in severe poverty. 3/4 of the poor were white. 24% of all Americans lived below the poverty line. These included the elderly, single mothers, farmers, and miners who lived in economically depressed regions like Appalachia. In 1964, 44% of the elderly had no health care coverage, and medical bills meant that more than 1 in 3 Americans over 65 were living below the poverty line. Hispanics in barrios and in farm labor camps, and Indians on reservations also lived in severe poverty. There was a fear that this underclass would rebel, like the blacks in the city. The high level of poverty in America undermined U.S. claims to be superior to communism. A lack of education was one cause of poverty. In 1964, 8 million American adults had less than 5 years of schooling. So that's like an elementary school education. Less than a complete elementary school education. Over 20 million had less than 8 years, and almost 1 in 4 had not graduated from high school. Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, in 1962, was a bestseller that revealed the extent of poverty throughout America and the suffering it caused. So even so, why was Lyndon Baines Johnson able to implement his Great Society programs? People have been dimly aware of poverty ever since the Progressive era. So why now? Was he able to push these policies through? He campaigned in 1964 for social and economic reform. This program promised, number one, abundance and liberty for all Americans, an end to poverty, and an end to racial injustice. And it's interesting, coming from a Texan, a Southerner, this is a guy who's pushing this forward. The 1964 election gave him a popular mandate with a landslide victory. He won 61% of the popular vote. He was elected by a coalition of urban Catholics, Southern whites, organized labor, black voters, and the middle class. He had a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress that were committed to passing all the legislation he proposed. Johnson was a talented politician who was highly persuasive, determined to win support. To get bills passed in Congress, he used the treatment, as he called it, where he would get in the face of reluctant Congress people and basically yell at them and push them to agree to his policies, until he had worn them down. Johnson found out as much as he could about each senator, what each wanted, and met with them frequently. He pressured people constantly. As a result, he got more of his proposals passed than any other president. In 1965 through 66, for example, 60 significant bills were passed. He convinced conservative business interests that they would benefit from better educated and trained workers who would become consumers of their products and who would not riot and destroy property and undermine capitalist democracy. He promised tax breaks and cuts in wasteful government spending. As a sympathetic Supreme Court upheld his laws and supported civil rights and civil liberties. The Supreme Court now had 4 new liberal justices appointed by Kennedy and Johnson. Chief Justice Earl Warren was considered liberal as well. Yet the war on poverty did not eliminate poverty in America. Well, why not? Number one, the programs were underfunded by Congress, especially programs specifically directed toward the poor. The main reason was the growing cost of the Vietnam War that absorbed millions of dollars that could have been spent in these other programs. Number two, there was a conservative backlash. Conservatives insisted that none of this was the job of the federal government. The war on poverty, they argued, wasted money and took money away from the hardworking taxpayer to give to lazy welfare recipients who became dependent on federal handouts and help. Many whites opposed programs, especially that helped blacks, particularly conservative white Southerners. And it was unprecedented to expand federal welfare programs with the intention of making them permanent rather than as a temporary response to an economic crisis, as the original New Deal programs of Roosevelt had been proposed. And number three, federal programs ran into conflict with established interest groups who wanted to retain their power, such as local political machines who opposed giving any power to the poor, and lobbyists that demanded compromises that undermined the programs. President Johnson himself said, quote, "The war on poverty is not fought on any single simple battlefield and will not be won in a generation. There are too many enemies: lack of jobs, bad housing, poor schools, lack of skills, discrimination. Each intensifies the other." But many of these programs still remain and were able to resist the conservative backlash in the 60s and even in the 80s. So these programs are still around, like Job Corps, Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. Now the funding of these they've been chipped away at, at various times, but they are more or less still around in various forms. And some Democrats, for example, even want to expand Medicare. Medicare for all is one of the campaign proposals of people like Bernie Sanders running for the presidency in 2020. So that's part of the 60s, this kind of welfare state, the expansion of this New Deal consensus that I've talked about. But another part of the 60s was the counterculture. The 1960s witnessed the emergence of a youth counterculture that rebelled against the conservative lifestyle of the 1950s and the gradually escalating war in Vietnam. The presence of this radical counterculture greatly complicated American society in the 1960s by questioning the U.S. government's ability to wage the Vietnam War and keep the social peace on the home front at the same time. The 1960s counterculture had economic, political, and cultural origins. Following economic factors enabled the counterculture. The Great Society programs we just talked about, for example, which greatly decreased poverty in America and provided many new kinds of job opportunities for young people, such as the Peace Corps. Historians have surmised that this underlying economic security was a key factor that enabled the youth of the 1960s to spend more time and energy on pursuing higher political ideals and living more experimental lifestyles, as opposed to worrying about the basics of their own financial security. The core demographic of the so-called hippies tended to be middle-class, college-attending whites, for example. So that kind of supports that argument. And you also had the baby boom after World War II, which caused a large cohort of young adults to come of age and attend college all at the same time during the mid to late 1960s. This demographic factor helped the youth counterculture and gave it the numbers to magnify its impact. And then the general post-World War II prosperity in America as well gave people a sense of security, a sense of being able to aim for higher ideals instead of being preoccupied with daily survival. The counterculture had its origins in the following political movements, such as the labor movement, which inspired the socialist-leaning college student group Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS as it was known. The Civil Rights Movement, which normalized college student activism and showed that social movements could be successful. Women's Liberation Movement, a new wave which was energized in particular by Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which argued that women lived increasingly restricted and unfulfilling lives as strictly gender norm conforming housewives, especially middle class women. The gay rights movement, which was energized by the Stonewall riot, a reaction to New York City police attempting to raid a gay nightclub to catch gays engaging in what were at the time illegal homosexual activities. The free speech movement, which first involved college students at Berkeley in 1964, demanding greater rights to protest on campus, and the anti Vietnam War cause. The counterculture also had some of its origins in the following cultural movements, such as rock and roll, the sexual revolution, encouraged by the development of the birth control pill in 1960, and of course, psychedelic drug taking, marijuana, LSD, and youth rebellion against conservative 1950s norms in general, which expressed itself in everything from wearing long hair to wearing bright, informal, tie-dyed clothing. So, a big part of the counterculture was reaction to the Vietnam War. So let's go a little bit into the origins of the Vietnam War. Vietnam was a region that had been conquered 3 times in its history. China had colonized Vietnam for 1,000 years, and the Vietnamese had absorbed the values of Confucianism, of basically obeying authority, thinking as a collective whole, before finally liberating themselves. In the 19th century, the French had colonized Vietnam as part of French Indochina, as it was called. And then the Japanese conquered Vietnam during World War II. The French fled or collaborated. A nationalist resistance movement called the Viet Minh was formed under the leader Ho Chi Minh. He had learned about the American and French revolutions and Marxism as a young man working in France, and he had visited America. When the Japanese were defeated, Vietnam declared independence, and in fact, Ho Chi Minh recited some of the exact words that were in the American Declaration of Independence, used it for his Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. So he kind of sympathized with the American Revolution, but he also kind of, by this point, sympathized with Marxism and communism too. So you could argue that he could have evolved either way at this point. But the US made the fateful decision of supporting the return of the French occupation to help rebuild the French economy, help it reclaim its colonies after World War II. And the Viet Minh fought on then to oust the French. The US was unwilling to send troops to aid France, but did decide to send $2.6 billion in aid to the French. But by 1954, the Viet Minh were winning against the French with a major victory at Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh were by now receiving assistance from China and the Soviet Union and had moved on from plain nationalism to become solidly communist, similarly to how Fidel Castro in Cuba evolved from kind of a simple anti-American Cuban nationalism to communism after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And the fact that he saw America was going to treat him with hostility either way, and he needed some sort of help, to stand up to the US. So he turned to the Soviet Union, and part of that package was accepting communism as well. Kind of a similar thing happened, you could argue, in Vietnam. In July 1954, a ceasefire was called, and Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, with communists under Ho Chi Minh in control of the north and the French in control of the south. An internationally monitored election was going to be held in 1956 to determine who would rule the entire nation. However, the leader of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, was autocratic and repressive, and the US feared that the people would vote for the communists instead, so they allowed Diem to cancel the elections. So the US was basically propping up a dictatorial puppet government in South Vietnam at this point. But still claiming that this was a more democratic alternative to letting the communists win these initial elections and then probably cancel all, elections going forward. The thinking was, yeah, we put up with this right-wing military dictator right now, but eventually we'll go back to having elections once the communist threat is put down. That was the idea. It never got around to that because the communist threat never went away in Vietnam. So in response, the Viet Minh resumed their efforts to unite the nation under communism. In South Vietnam, a communist insurgency arose, the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, or VCs, or Victor Charlies, or just Charlie, as American troops would refer to them. So this is how the Vietnam War was a little bit different than the Korean War, where the U.S. didn't really have to deal with an insurgency behind their own front line. They just had to deal with the enemy, the opposing enemy, who was clearly on an opposing side of the military front. There wasn't a strong insurgency in South Korea to help the communists, but there was in Vietnam, which made the Vietnam War much more difficult to win, because you didn't just have to defeat the external enemy, you had to defeat the internal enemy and win the hearts and minds of South Vietnamese peasants away from communism so that they wouldn't keep supporting the communists. The North Vietnamese Viet Minh saw their goal as liberating the South and reuniting the country. At this point, even still, nationalism was their strongest motive. And they had already kicked out 3 occupying forces. I mean, the Vietnam historically had already kicked out, the Chinese, the French, the Japanese. So as far as they were concerned, this was just finishing the job. They focused on supplying and assisting the Southern National Liberation Army, which used guerrilla warfare to harass and kill U.S. troops, but also built up a regular army for the Tet Offensive and later for the final conquest of South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh's tactics were based on the classic Chinese treatise Sun Tzu's The Art of War and the tactics of George Washington in the American Revolution. He understood the value of prolonging the war as long as possible and undermining the morale on the home front in America. The Americans, firmly believing in the domino theory, believed that they were fighting Soviet expansionism in Vietnam. They had made an open commitment to combating communism throughout the world and felt that the U.S. had no choice but to intervene, or else look like a pushover and invite Soviet expansionism elsewhere in the world. If we don't stick to our containment doctrine here, it's not going to be a credible threat, anywhere else. And the Soviet Union is just going to expand more and more. There was also an alleged incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam that was used to justify escalating America's involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. military claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had taken hostile action against U.S. naval vessels, but later it turned out that the reports had been exaggerated and partly fabricated in order to produce a justification for escalation. So this is kind of, in a lot of wars that the U.S. has gotten into, like the Spanish-American War, this Vietnam War, some sort of naval incident is used as a justification, which I find interesting. And a lot of times these naval incidents turns out to be difficult to figure out if they were actually exaggerated at first, which is why some people were skeptical a few months ago when reports were that Iran had attacked some boats of U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf. Some people were wondering if this was Gulf of Tonkin all over again. The U.S. will have to work hard to rebuild its credibility going forward after these sorts of things. In Vietnam, the U.S. strategy was twofold. Number one, to bomb North Vietnam into submission and to destroy the supply route from there, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and to destroy all communism in South Vietnam and win the hearts and minds of the people there. The U.S. Army was more accustomed to conventional warfare, but also used the tactics that had worked against guerrilla warfare in the Philippines in the early 1900s. However, unlike the Filipinos, armed with nothing but bolo knives, the Vietnamese guerrillas could import all the modern war supplies they needed. The Americans' World War II tactic of saturation bombing of enemy military targets was not effective in North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder dropped 3 times the entire amount of bombs used in World War II on North Vietnam, and Agent Orange was sprayed to defoliate forests so the U.S. could bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was used to transport military supplies down to the Viet Cong, and napalm was used to burn villages and the enemy. It's a very sticky sort of, almost like gasoline, like a jelly-like or glue-like substance that burns and sticks to people and buildings. uh, which had horrible effects on civilians. So why did all this not work? Well, unlike Germany, North Vietnam was a pre-industrial peasant society. It did not have many factories, plants, power stations, railroad stations, etc. to bomb. Instead, it imported most of its military materials from China and Russia. And the US could not attack Russian shipping. So what do? You bomb peasant villages for whatever that's worth, right? In addition, the Viet Minh went literally underground. They dug hundreds of miles of tunnels and underground caverns for storage. The US did not know where anything was from the air. Thousands of North Vietnamese were assigned the job of rebuilding the Ho Chi Minh Trail, moving the road to a new location and getting it going again within hours of each bombing. The bombing destroyed Vietnamese villages and lives, which angered and alienated the Vietnamese peasants, inspiring even more of them to support the fight against the Americans. And then there's the body count. In South Vietnam, the tactic was to kill all the Viet Cong soldiers and report the numbers to headquarters. The army was sent out in small units to search and destroy, rather than occupy and accumulate control over territory. Because the U.S. really didn't have enough troops to do that systematically through all of Vietnam. American soldiers faced booby traps, ambushes, and explosives, and it was difficult to find and identify Viet Cong soldiers, and villagers often betrayed the Americans. Many villagers were killed and were included in the body count as supposed Viet Cong. No matter how many were killed, it seemed like more Vietnamese took their place, though. Understandably, when they lost a family member and became determined to get revenge on the Americans. Part of the strategy was pacification, to cut the guerrillas, the Viet Cong, off from their supplies and their support in the villages, and to teach the villagers to embrace American capitalist democracy rather than communism. The army destroyed many villages, crowding the former residents into a central strategic hamlet where they could kind of be monitored, and killing everything in the free fire zone around it. Other villagers were sent to the city or to refugee camps. Destroying the villages was actually the worst thing to do to the Vietnamese, as their whole identity and way of life was in the village. This only made the villagers even more determined to aid the communists. And then the armies. The South Vietnamese army was not proficient, and the U.S. Army developed morale problems as the war dragged on and experienced men finished their tours of duty. The draft forced many unwilling recruits to serve in a war that they did not believe in. Many soldiers mostly focused on keeping themselves and their buddies alive to return home. Many took drugs and drank heavily. Desertions were common, and some even murdered their hated officers. So that was all going on in the field. In the home front, things got turbulent as well. The U.S. ended the Vietnam War not only because the Vietnamese were difficult to defeat, but because the majority of the American people no longer supported the war. How did this happen? Number one was the draft. This war required a draft to build its army, unlike the recent Iraq War. While many draftees and volunteers were patriotic anti-communists, many more had no desire to fight in this war. And, unlike in World War II, not as many Americans were fully committed to the cause. There was much draft dodging through burning draft cards, attempting to claim homosexuality, pacifism, or medical defects, or escape to Canada. For much of the war, going to college deferred your call-up. So many recruits ended up being disproportionately working class and black, and some of them rebelled as well. Sometimes they went into service, but then rebelled once they got into the field and would refuse to carry out orders, would assassinate their commanding officers. So all this resistance to the draft, because most recruits were not really convinced of the cause like they were in World War II. Number two is large numbers of college students opposed the war from the start. They held teach-ins and went on marches and demonstrations. Number three, television and newspaper coverage of the war changed public opinion. This was the first televised war, and Americans watched the horrors of war in their own living rooms. Many were appalled. The footage of the Vietnamese general casually shooting a nearby prisoner in the head in the famous photograph of the little girl bombed with napalm. You've probably seen these photographs before. These deeply affected Americans. The Tet Offensive was not successful for the Viet Cong in a military sense, but it destroyed confidence in the government's announcements that victory was imminent, and the footage of the U.S. Embassy being attacked was demoralizing. And there were very few restrictions on newspapers and TV channels of showing all these gory details. So that demoralized Americans. Before in World War II, the media had been prohibited from having such close access. And ever since the Vietnam War, the U.S. military has tended to go back to a strategy of restricting access somewhat. Number 4, a growing number of political leaders publicly opposed the war, such as George F. Kennan, architect of the containment policy. Robert McNamara resigned as Secretary of Defense. So did Undersecretary of State George Ball, Robert Kennedy, William Fulbright, just a whole bunch of figures, which you don't really need to remember specifically, but even a lot of high-ranking people were coming out against the war eventually. The war became a big issue in the 1968 presidential campaign. Johnson announced that the U.S. would seek a political settlement through negotiations with the Viet Cong and Viet Minh, and there would be no more bombing of North Vietnam over the 20th parallel. Then he announced he would not run again. The Democrats' candidates Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy ran on anti-war platforms. Vice President Hubert Humphrey campaigned against the war too, although a little bit more half-heartedly, I guess. All that said, Nixon basically won the 1968 presidential campaign, promising to de-escalate the war, but then he ended up re-escalating it when his original tactics didn't work. He thought it'd be easy to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. Turned out they weren't buying what he was offering, so he started to increase the bombing of North Vietnam again, bombing Hanoi and mining its harbor, putting pressure on the Soviets and Chinese to stop supplying them, bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia and Laos, and actually invading these two neighboring countries, Cambodia and Laos, to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So these were huge escalations, after promising that he was going to try to de-escalate America from the Vietnam War. He re-escalated even further. The resumption of American warfare, especially the invasion of Cambodia, led to massive anti-war protests in the U.S., such as the famous Kent State protest where college students were gunned down by the National Guard. Then there was the My Lai massacre. In 1970, Americans were horrified to hear about the My Lai massacre in 1968 and its cover-up by the military. Lieutenant William Cawley led Charlie Company into this village of My Lai to find and kill Viet Cong, but instead they just ended up massacring between 300 and 600 elderly women and children over 3 hours while helicopters circled ahead and saw what was going on. But these were obviously just civilians. But American troops didn't trust civilians at that point, and they took out their frustrations on these civilians. And finally, number 8 was the Pentagon Papers in 1971. The release of the Defense Department's secret report on the war, the Pentagon Papers, revealed that the U.S. government had lied about the operations in Vietnam from the start, and the body counts were mostly fictitious. In response, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And eventually, U.S. forces would completely pull out of Vietnam by 1973. And in 1975, the communists were able to conquer the remaining non-communist South Vietnamese government and reunite all of Vietnam under a communist government. But did the domino theory, which was every Cold Warrior's worst fear, end up happening? Not really. Instead of trying to spread their revolution abroad, as the Cubans had done, the Vietnamese mostly minded their own business and focused on rebuilding their country. And today, Vietnam still has a government that calls itself communist, but Vietnam is on more or less friendly terms with the United States, and much of our clothing is imported from Vietnam. So all that fighting only to end up basically, you know, coming to a truce with this communist government that we were so afraid of. So that is the turbulent 60s, which kind of stretched into the early 1970s a little bit. Next lesson, we'll kind of look at the 70s malaise and the conservative reaction of the 1980s. But until then, best wishes.